Hello. Today I will be giving instructions for how to practice Zazen meditation. There are many types of meditation. Zazen is simply one of them. The original instructions for Zazen meditation state that there are 4 approved postures for meditating: sitting, standing, walking, or lying down. I will be giving instructions for seated Zazen meditation, though of course you are free to practice however you feel called to do so. When practicing seated meditation, you have an option to be seated on a chair, which is where I currently am. You also have the option to be seated on the floor on a cushion. If you are seated on the floor, there are several different configurations in which you should sit. You generally want to be seated on a cushion so that your hips can be raised up a little bit above the ground, which is just a more comfortable ergonomic position. As I am not seated on a cushion at the moment, it is a little difficult to give a visual demonstration of what that might look like. You may sit in a lotus position, which is a variation of the knees crossed and the ankles crossed. In this position, it is important that your knees make contact with the ground. You don't want to sit in the position that I have heard called crisscross applesauce, which is where your feet and ankles are crossed and make contact with the ground, and your knees are raised up above that. You will find that is a very difficult position to maintain for an extended period of time. If you are unable to have your knees make contact with the ground from that position, I recommend you choose a different seated position. The position called Zazen is when your right leg is to your right side, your left leg is to your left side, and you are on your knees. The front of your shins and the top of your ankles are all making contact with the earth. There are special benches called Zazen benches that can make this seated position easier. If you are seated on a chair, as I am, it is preferable to be seated on a chair where your feet are able to make full contact with the ground. You don't want the chair to be so high up that your feet are just dangling or just your toes can make a little contact with the earth. The second piece of guidance is that you do not want your back rested against the back of the chair. You want to be seated forward a little. My back is not making contact at all with the chair behind me. Now, this recommendation, sometimes people have physical limitations and that's not something that their body is physically able to do, in which case, of course, do what is best for your body. The reason it is preferable to not have your back against the back of the chair is so this way you can fully be engaged in your torso and upper body, and you are able to have your back be sort of in a straight line. Not that we're trying to make it exactly a straight line, but when you are seated back in a chair, often there is a curve to your spine, and we often become less connected with our torsos because we just relax all of the muscles involved in them. And while we are seated, we do generally want it to be in a relaxed position. We want to be comfortable and able to hold this position for a while. In general, we are still an amount of our energy is engaged in maintaining our torso to be upright, and that just helps the flow of the breath and the flow of use the word energy if that works for you. If the word energy does not resonate, then we will just say the general flow of the meditation. So beginning from the top of the head and going down, you want to do your best to make sure that your head is kind of straight on your body and looking out in a rather level position. We want to make sure that our head isn't too far up. That often means we are slouched in some way. You also want to make sure your head is not fully tucked down to the chest like that. Just experiment with what feels best for your body. The general recommendation for Zazen meditation is for the eyes to be open. This is quite different than how many people have practiced meditation. While my recommendation is always to do what feels right for your body, if you have only ever meditated with your eyes closed, I do recommend trying with your eyes open for a while and just see what you might get out of that experience. With your eyes open, you want to have a soft focus, which means we're not specifically focusing in on something in particular, but our eyes are sort of just generally taking in everything around us. You want to pick a spot on the floor, several feet in front of you on the ground, so we're not looking straight down and we're not looking straight out. We are turned our eyes downward somewhat, and we have a soft focus at that point on the ground. The reason that was explained to me why we have our eyes open during meditation is because when we have our eyes closed, what we tend to do is to create this separation, division. Everything outside of me, I have closed my eyes off to it. Outside of me is outside of me. Inside of me is inside of me. And there is a stark division between the two. When you have your eyes open and you begin the process of meditation, what can happen over time is there begins to feel like less of a boundary between you and the outside world. It is not a duality. It is not inside of me and outside of me. I have a perception inside of me. I have this perception in the outside world. Slowly the boundary starts to kind of become, where do I end and the world begins? And that's just a very interesting place to be in meditation, and can be a helpful state of mind for more advanced meditation. The next recommendation is to breathe through your nose for Zazen meditation. What I find is if you are to try to breathe in through your nose a couple breaths and try to breathe in through your mouth a couple breaths, if one is much easier than the other, then breathe that way, regardless of what the official recommendation is. But if it's easy enough to breathe through both of them, I do recommend just to try to breathe through the nose and see if you notice how that might change your practice. But some of us do have some deviations in our nasal passages, and it just is more difficult for us to breathe through our nose. So that's perfectly fine. You can breathe through your mouth. The tongue is to be generally kept around where the back of the front teeth meet the roof of the mouth. This isn't an exact place you need to hold your tongue. It's just a general, a target to aim for. What we do want to make sure is that our jaws are not clenched super, super tight, and they are not slacked so much. We're looking for kind of a happy medium in there. So the officially recommended hand position, or mudra, I believe mudra means hand position. So your hands are down in your lap, but the camera can't see right there, so I'll do it up here so you can see better. The dominant hand, which for me is my right hand, goes on the bottom. The non-dominant hand rests on top, so both of your palms are facing upward, and the thumbs come together to lightly touch. I have heard it described as you want the thumbs to come together with enough pressure to hold one piece of paper. So if you can kind of imagine, that means that the thumbs are indeed touching. They're not apart, but they're not so forcefully digging into each other and exerting all this tension and energy. They're really just ever so lightly resting there. And you do generally want the thumbs to be up like this to create kind of a circle in the hands, as opposed to all the way down here making contact with your palms. However, I find that as long as we kind of have the intention of doing that initially, it is okay if during the meditation process your thumbs kind of start to drift a little bit. I think that's just fine. And you want to have your this mudra hand position gently resting on your lap. And that is true for any seated position you are in, whether you are in a chair or you are sitting on a cushion. You want that to be gently resting in your lap. So we want to think of the spine. We don't want the shoulders to be caved in and we're sinking into this position. We want to have our spine and shoulders be a bit more upright. However, we also don't want to be so rigid in our posture and trying to force our shoulders back and trying to have our spine be straight in an unnatural position. We really want to find balance between I am not engaging any muscles and I'm completely collapsing into this slouch, versus I am holding every single muscle exactly where it's supposed to be for exactly perfect posture. We want to find a happy middle ground in between the two of those. So now in terms of the actual meditation practice, now that we've covered how to hold our physical bodies, so at its simplest, we are breathing and we are paying attention and focusing to our breath. So on the in breath, we simply notice I am breathing in. On the out breath, we simply notice I am breathing out. We are not doing anything to guide these breaths. We are not attempting to have deep, full breaths. We are not attempting to have shallow breaths. We are not guiding our breath to make sure it goes all the way down into our diaphragm and a nice, big, expansive belly. And we're not trying to not do that either. We are simply paying attention to what our breath is doing. We are just aware of as many facets of our breath as we can be. We are aware when we are breathing in. We are aware when we are breathing out. We are aware when it is a big, full breath. We are aware when it is a short, shallow breath. And so we keep returning our attention to our breath. Now, of course, it is human nature of the mind. We're going to have all these other thoughts. The goal is not to stop ourselves from having other thoughts. The goal is to be aware when another thought enters our field, and to the best of our ability, not let that thought carry us away from focusing on our breath. Now, of course, that's going to happen from time to time, and that's just fine. When we notice that our mind has followed another thought and is no longer on our breath anymore, we notice that and we return our thoughts to the breath. So, as a part of beginning Zazen meditation instructions, it is typically recommended to count the breaths as a form of anchoring ourselves to the breath. So when we breathe in, we say internally to ourselves, 1. When we breathe out, we say internally to ourselves, 2. The next in-breath is 3. The next out-breath is 4. If your mind has carried you off, you simply notice that. Begin the next in-breath with a count of 1. If you make it all the way to 10, you simply start again at 1. The goal is not to make it to 10. The goal is not to not get carried off by the thoughts. The goal is to, no matter what happens, just return to the practice. You may notice over time, if you practice Zazen regularly, that some things begin to change, and it's not the same as the first time you practice. It is common to notice over time that you are getting carried away less and less by your thoughts. They're becoming less sticky and attractive, and that it is easier to keep your mind focused on your breath. That is a common thing to notice if you have been practicing meditation regularly. However, that is not the point or the goal. That is simply something that might happen, and you might become aware of that. And if you do, just become aware of it. And that's it. But the goal is not to reach that point. The goal is simply to practice. When you are meditating, you return to the breath. And that is the entire goal. You may notice meditation for you changes over time. You may not. Either way, you are actively practicing and performing meditation. So, after you have been practicing meditation for a while, sometimes it is recommended to stop the counting of the breath practice. I have heard counting of the breaths referred to as kind of like a training wheels when riding your bike. It can be really helpful initially in the practice. It can be difficult to discern on your own whether or not it is time to let go of the counting of the breaths. The easiest and recommended way of proceeding is to find a meditation teacher that you can work with directly, and they will help guide you when or if at all it is time to move on to no longer counting the breaths. However, I know that sometimes finding a direct meditation teacher is inaccessible, or might simply just not be a part of your path. So rather than tell you you have to find a meditation teacher, that's the only way, I'm not going to tell you that. What I'm going to say is just listen to your intuition. If you feel that counting your breaths is keeping you focused on your breath and helping you return to the thought practice of being mindful of your breath, then continue doing it. If you feel that counting the breaths, which is to say, saying the number in your mind, 1, 2, if you feel like that detracts from your ability to stay mindfully with your breath, then perhaps try letting that practice go, and rather than saying the numbers in your head, just be aware of the breath itself. You are your own guide here, including you are your guide of whether or not to find a meditation teacher, or to find a community to practice with, or to continue solo practice yourself. And I trust you being on your own journey here. I do recommend setting a timer for your practice rather than just doing it for however long you feel like. I find it best to commit to an amount of time, because then you can just set a timer, and then you are no longer worrying about, do I want to keep going? How am I feeling here? Oh, what time is it getting to be? I'm gonna be late if I go longer than such and such. All those are just, we're opening up the door to opportunities for thoughts to take us away. So I really recommend instead setting the timer out of your sight, something that you're going to hear, or it will vibrate or something like that. And then after you set it, you are free to just focus on the practice. The recommendations that I heard are that somewhere around 24 to 25 minutes is the minimum recommendation for starting Zazen. I think meditating for 25 minutes or 40 minutes or an hour is really wonderful, but I find that to be a very inaccessible amount of time to begin with for most people. So if 25 minutes sounds too long to you, perhaps do set a timer for 5 minutes. You can really set a timer for however long you'd like. If you want to practice Zazen for 1 minute every morning, you go right ahead. I do think you may find, as you continue the practice, that it becomes easier for you to meditate for longer periods of time. If initially 10 minutes feels like a very long time to you, but you practice 10 minutes every day, you may notice in the future 20 or 30 minutes feels fine. That is yet again a thing that may happen if you practice Zazen regularly, but that is not a goal. That does not need to happen for you to be practicing Zazen and practicing it validly. So if you'd like, you may practice Zazen with me now for 2 minutes. Make yourself comfortable experiment with your positioning and posture, and I will set a timer for 2 minutes. When the timer begins, you will hear a few bells, and when the timer ends, you will hear another couple bells. So just 2 minutes. All right, let us begin. I always like to bow after my practice. That's simply how I was taught, so that's the way that I prefer to end my meditation. So I'm very curious how that went for you and what you noticed and what came up. One thing you may have noticed is that you wanted to shift and move your body or scratch your nose. The way Zazen was taught to me is that you never move during meditation, no matter what. If your nose itches, you let it itch. If your leg falls asleep, you let it fall asleep. If your back starts to hurt very much, you let it hurt. And you think of all of those things as just thoughts that are trying to pull you away from meditation, just the same as any other thought. Now, I don't believe that that is the right approach for everyone, so I simply say to you to use your best discernment and judgment. If your nose itches, I would really like you to consider, do I really need to itch my nose? If your leg starts to hurt, I would like you to ask yourself, do I really need to adjust and move? And then after you ask yourself that, trust whatever your judgment is. I do think there is some merit in recognizing that some of these external sensations, such as the desire to itch your nose, are not thoughts we need to follow. And maybe if you don't itch your nose, after a while the itch will go away. And that can be a really wonderful realization to have. But at the same time, I also think that it can be a disservice to our own bodies and intuitions if we are in pain and we choose to only deny that pain and suffer through it. And I don't know that that is always the best course of action for everyone. So I very much encourage you to listen to yourself and do what feels right with your body, but be open to challenging those thoughts that say, I must do this right now. And just see where that leads you. All right. Thank you very, very much for allowing me to teach you what I have learned about Zazen meditation. Of course, I don't know everything. I'm simply passing on what I do know. Thank you so much for joining me today.